homogenous, or not homogenous, but a large community that's otherwise cohesive, dividing them into men and boys or girls and women. And I'm left with the question, if the inquiry has a topic that restricts it to only girls and women, what will the outcome be? Will the outcome be recommendations that apply to girls and women, not to people who are victims? Will the inquiry say, for example, girls and women need better education, girls and women need better housing, girls and women need more police protection, and not say a word about the rest of the community, not talk about the boys and the men who are in similar, comparable situations? Today we have a number of other people who would like to address the issue. I will introduce the next as the Executive Director of the Canadian Association for Equality, Justin Trottier.
Thank you, Robert. It's an honor to be joined by the individuals that are sharing this podium with me to formally kick off the Expand the Inquiry Coalition. Our goal really is to build a broad consensus on the need to enhance the inquiry, and we really do see what we're doing is enhancing it by expanding it to include the other half of the picture. I'm going to tell you very briefly a little bit about the Canadian Association for Equality and why we have a stake in this. We've been playing an important supporting role in building this coalition, and our goal as an organization is to integrate boys and men, their issues, their perspectives, their lived experiences in our efforts at achieving gender equality broadly. We're an evidence-based organization. We believe in evidence-based public policy. We're also a solutions-oriented, educational, charitable organization. We aim to move beyond ideology and special interest politics and make progress for families, for individual families across Canada. We're guided by the values of equality, inclusion, collaboration, and we focus on the individual human rights of each and every person. All these elements which constitute the basic identity of CAFE, the Association for Equality, make us ideally suited to play a key supporting role in building this coalition. But we are very proud that this initiative has been led from the beginning by Indigenous leaders and community organizations. It was conceived of, developed, and now led by prominent members of First Nations communities, as well as mothers and fathers all across Canada. Let me tell you very briefly about the coalition. It was sparked by Lydia Daniels, a member of a First Nations community it's outside of Winnipeg, Manitoba, who tragically her son Colton Pratt went missing in 2014, still is missing. Sparked on by her initiative, we have been assisting with local events all across Canada, and then finally now under the leadership of Chief Ernie Crey, who joins me on stage here today, he is now chairing the committee, or the coalition rather, and now we are ready to make our requests known to the government and to other policymakers. In the packages which you have access to here today, you will see a backgrounder on the coalition, our motives, the meetings that we're having this week, including a public event that we had last night with UBC Professor of Political Science Adam Jones, who's done a great deal of research and compiling of statistics on this issue, and you'll get a backgrounder in that package as well. I just want to thank everybody for being here today, and I'm going to introduce our keynote, our guest of honor here, Chief Ernie Crey.
Thank you, Justin. This is an important day. You know, between 1982 and 2011, 70% of all of Canada's missing and murdered Indigenous people were young men and boys. I'm afraid to report these disappearances and deaths continue to this day. I was one of the main advocates for the first inquiry we had in Canada into missing and murdered women. That's because my sister was a victim of Canada's most notorious serial killer, Robert Willie Pickton. But as preparations for that inquiry were underway and all the work that was involved in it, I started to get messages from all parts of Canada, from Indigenous and non-Indigenous families who were saying, "Wonderful work, Chief Crey. Keep it up. I'm glad you're there doing it. But you know what? The person missing in my family is a young boy, my son, or my uncle, or my grandfather. They're missing. And when we report their disappearances to police, we get short shrift. We're not sure what the police are doing, if they're taking the investigation the requisite investigations into these disappearances and deaths, often many of them in very violent circumstances. No one keeps us informed. No one reports back to us. And then came the national inquiry, and many of us in British Columbia, but also Indigenous people from other parts of Canada, lobbied hard to get this national inquiry. And again, all along the way, these families remained in touch with me, and additionally, more families. So now it's in the dozens and dozens and dozens of families that are asking that there be advocacy on their behalf where their missing family members are concerned, young men particularly, and boys. I couldn't ignore it any longer. And so I reached out and I found the people here that you see standing with me. I'm happy to stand with them. And we've founded this coalition, and it's our intent, it's our plan, it's our objective to get the national inquiry that's underway now, open its doors to these families who have important stories to tell, tragic stories, but very important for Canadian stories, very important that Canadians hear. How can you reach a conclusion, make findings, and make recommendations about the deaths and disappearances of just half of Canada's Indigenous peoples? And there are other Canadians as well. You know, these recommendations and the findings, and I can only guess as to what they might be, but for them to be really meaningful for the Aboriginal community, to be really meaningful for policymakers and social planners, for government, for First Nations governments, and for the families that have been deeply affected. The only way this can all make sense in the end is if we focus some of the attention on missing Indigenous men and boys. We'll have, therefore, a comprehensive picture of what's going on. And finally, I want to encourage Indigenous families from coast to coast to coast to put in an appearance at the inquiry once it gets underway, once they start holding their hearings in different parts of Canada. I want these families who have contacted me and many, many other families to put in an appearance at this national inquiry and tell the Chief Commissioner and her fellow commissioners and all of Canadians who will be looking on, and I might add, the world will be looking on. I want these families to show up at the hearings and share their stories with Canadians, a story that they need to hear. And policymakers and politicians and the like need to hear this, because if they're going to do a better job on behalf of these families and do justice for the ones that have vanished, who have disappeared, who have died violent deaths, that they can do a better job on behalf of these families and these young Indigenous men and boys across the country. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Chief Ernie Crey. I am here today because I have a strong belief that in order for Canada to move forward with reconciliation, we need to acknowledge this issue. We need to acknowledge that Indigenous populations as a whole experience victimization at a higher rate than other populations, and it's important that we understand why that is. Why aren't we questioning this fact of Indigenous boys and men being victims of violence at a higher rate than women and girls? And that's the question that I ask everybody today: is why aren't we taking that the moment to consider the factors, related to the intersection of gender, race, and colonial history, and how that has impacted men and boys today in First Nations communities, in urban centers. I've had the experience as a social worker in the areas of mental health and child welfare to meet a lot of the families out there and to understand their personal situations. And, in addition to my own personal situation, where my father was murdered when I was a child. And so that, really really frustrates me, and the issue itself, and and why aren't we looking at the broader matter, right? And looking at what's creating that and addressing it from there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're open to any questions that you might have.
I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about Two-Spirit people. How do they fit into this inquiry?
Justin.
Sure. Well, I can tell you more from the point of view of the Canadian Association for Equality, which is one of the organizations that was proud to join with Indigenous leaders in building this coalition, that our approach, and I think it's true about the values of our coalition as a whole, is really gender inclusive. So our point is not to leave anybody behind. So when we talk about expanding the inquiry so it is for all genders, and as just an aside, we do a lot of work about not leaving anybody behind when it comes to violence in general among all Canadians. So whether it's domestic abuse, intimate partner violence, other forms of violence, we're constantly reminding policymakers that this is something where there are victims of all genders: men, women, transgendered individuals, two-spirited individuals. So the same would go for our approach in terms of this coalition's goals. We don't want to leave anybody behind. We really do mean for a gender inclusive inquiry. Anybody want to add to that?
Was that satisfactory? Is that an answer?
Sure. If you'd like
Is there any?
Yeah, I don't know if any of the four of you have experience with Two-Spirit people. I'm curious, yeah, is there anything in particular? I've spoken with some of the families of Two-Spirit people. They've talked about how there's systematic things that they deal with. I'm just curious if that's been considered by your coalition.
Well, as Justin put it, we wouldn't try to categorize as to who should be included in the. We're not divisive, so two-spirited people would fall into the category of people, and that's who the inquiry should be about: the effects of violence on individuals.
Maybe I'm asking you all to speculate, but why do you think it has been cast as women and girls with this inquiry?
Well, I can give you two answers. The one is that the one that we've heard from the Minister, Carolyn Bennett, who says that the inquiry has been cast in the way it has because of the pressure that she got from both Canadians and international communities to do it this way. Her intent was not necessarily focused on providing a solution to a problem, but to appeasing a group that had made requests to her. The speculative part of the answer might be that women and girls typically have a different attraction for protection than others, particularly men and boys. We tend not to protect men and boys, and we tend to expect men and boys to take the protection into their own hands or to suck it up. That's more of a speculative answer, though.
If I can just build on that, and I'm happy for anybody else to speak as well, but just to sort of build on what Robert said, I think we've noticed, given the work that we do to try to integrate both men and women, boys and girls in our efforts at gender equality, that there does seem to be an unfortunate tendency to simplify things into a kind of victim-perpetrator binary modality, where men and even boys are often lumped into that perpetrator side of things, and girls and women into the victim side. The research doesn't bear that out. The research shows, as I referred to earlier when I talked about all violence, not just in the Indigenous communities, but all violence across Canada, is something that both men and women perpetrate and that men and women both suffer from. And in the context specifically of the inquiry, if we're going to get at the core issues, because the core issues are complicated, it's not only violence, it's also how violence intersects with gender, with race, with history of colonialism, as you've heard, but also with factors to do with drug and substance abuse, underemployment, incarceration, these really complicated issues. If we're really going to find the problems and identify solutions, we cannot leave out half the picture. We cannot leave out the half of the equation, by which I mean men and boys, who, again, just looking at the statistics, are more represented than women and girls in terms of those factors I just referred to, the unemployment and underemployment, the drug and substance abuse, the incarceration, etc. We have to take an honest look and be prepared to look at all the different scenarios and all the different factors. We simply cannot do that if we leave out half the picture and half the people. So this is really, and we sincerely believe this is about enhancing the inquiry, not about being divisive or polarizing, but about making it stronger and more effective.
Any other questions?
Hi again.
Hi.
What kind of feedback have you all had from the government of the minister, but also like the inquiry now? They've got commissioners, and I'm curious. Like the four of you, have you had any interaction? What happens?
We've initially sent a letter to Minister Bennett. That was in early October, and we're still waiting for the answer. We don't have an answer yet. We suggested to her the things that we've talked about here, that a national inquiry into violence against Aboriginal communities ought to include everyone in those communities. And as I say, she is yet to respond to that. The groundswell of individuals that we've spoken to are extraordinarily supportive of including everyone in the inquiry. There are those who suggest that the inquiry is now well underway and that it's too late to make any changes, but don't disagree that the questions that we raise need to be answered.
Can I just add very briefly? We also did have the opportunity and the honor to meet briefly this morning with the Justice Minister, and she did tell us that the terms of reference for the inquiry are broad enough that if the commissioners wanted, they could be the terms could be interpreted in a way that issues to do with men and boys could be included. And I guess that's being left at the discretion of the commissioners. But I think it would be interesting for the media to ask follow-up questions to the Minister of Justice, as well as the commissioners. Will you interpret the terms of the inquiry in a way where families do come forward? And Chief Ernie Crey will tell you about some of these heartbreaking stories that he's heard, these hundreds of stories, these families that he's heard from. If these families do want to present to the inquiry, are they going to be turned away, or will the terms of reference be open and broad enough that they will be welcomed in? And in a sense, the inquiry will morph into something much more expansive and I think more powerful in terms of the outcomes than it looks like it's going to be right now. But that would be a question for the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, and the commissioners.
Want to add to that? Keep going.
Are we good?
Yep.
Good? Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.